speaking to you from the Columbia University campus. So I'm going to talk to you about strategies for urban energy resilience today. First, I'm going to talk about the consequences of climate change, New York City's methods for adapting to climate change, our response to Hurricane Sandy, which was probably the most extreme weather event we've experienced here over the last decade or so, our methods for mitigating climate change. Then I'll speak more generally about building environmentally sustainable cities, strategies and key takeaways, and take your questions if possible. So what are the consequences of climate change? Well, first, a warming planet has made the ocean warmer, increased evaporation, and added moisture to storm systems. I think every environmental scientist and most people on the planet understand this now. And what this is doing is increasing the frequency and intensity of storms, which will only continue to worsen as climate change increases. So 20 years ago, we had climate models predicting that by 2020, this would happen, and it's all happening. And so it's no longer something climate change is no longer something that's created everywhere and will take place in the future. It's something that's created everywhere and is taking place right now. So what's the impact of this on urban environments? And one of the issues that we have is that more and more people on the planet have put their settlements in the pathways of exposure to extreme weather events. With over 8 billion people on the planet, more people live near shorelines, near forests, and are potentially vulnerable to extreme weather events. Also, our lifestyles, where we have drywall in our homes and electricity and water systems interconnected, are all vulnerable to the impact of extreme weather events. High concentrations of people and infrastructure means that destruction in urban areas can reach unprecedented levels, destroying entire communities and creating massive financial burdens on insurance industries and on governments to deal with extreme weather events. Also, during some extreme weather events, it may be difficult and even impossible to reach people in need. Road flooding can cause gridlock, delaying response. Sometimes first responders can't get to people in need. Homes may be unreachable. Frequently, communications, including emergency communications, can be disrupted. Hospitals may be damaged, further complicating response and endangering lives. Our lifestyles are energy dependent. We rely on shared energy, water, sewage, and sanitation services, and disruption of these resources and services can have a massive impact on modern lifestyles. During Hurricane Sandy, New York was without energy for a couple of weeks, and living with teenagers was not something I'd recommend for anybody when they didn't have access to their friends on Facebook. Now, recovery from these events is both expensive and time intensive, often requiring enhanced shelter resources and disrupting communities. For school-age children, the impact and the disruption of schooling, social life, and family life can be long-term. They talk about a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder for people, young people in particular, who see their whole lives turned around for a year or two. Now, at my age, a year is 3% of my life. At a 10-year-old's life, it's a much higher proportion of their experience. And so it takes longer for them to get over it. So there's also, of course, in addition to extreme weather events, there's a connection between climate change and sea level rise. Cities like Miami in the United States have flooding even when there's no rain, when there's high tide. Glaciers are melting, and when the ice melts, it adds to the volume of water in the world's oceans. The United States has about 20,000 kilometers of coastline. New York City has about 850 kilometers of coastline. By 2050, the sea level along the U.S. coastline is projected to rise by 25 to 30 centimeters. Brazil has roughly 7,400 kilometers of coastline, and Rio has 83 kilometers of coastline. By 2050, the sea level along the Brazilian shoreline is projected to rise by 20 to 25 centimeters. Even without extreme weather events, rising sea level coupled with normal tidal cycles can cause flooding without storms. We're already beginning to see this in many places that are just a few feet above sea level. So let me talk a little bit about my home city, New York City, and the climate challenges that we face. When you're in New York City, you sometimes don't realize it because there's all these big buildings. But in fact, New York City is comprised of a number of islands, Manhattan Island, Staten Island, and Long Island, which is where Queens and Brooklyn is. In fact, the only part of New York City that's on the American mainland is the Bronx. And New York City is very vulnerable to flooding from extreme weather and sea level rise. This is something we share with your cities in Brazil. Heat in New York City, particularly in Manhattan, is at times hotter than the surrounding area due to a phenomenon called the urban heat island effect, leading not only to health risks for its inhabitants, but also increased demand on the electricity grid for air conditioning. And heavy storms in urban environments pose risks to the wastewater system, sometimes resulting in overflows of sewage treatment areas. And what we have in New York City is what's called a combined sewer system, which means the sewage from your household and the rainwater sewage from the street is combined. And when there's too much rainwater, it overwhelms the sewage treatment plants. And so what happens is the sewage is directly released into the rivers. This, of course, causes massive pollution and is something that we want to avoid if at all possible. Despite all of these issues, New York City is working to adapt to climate change. We are spending billions of dollars, and we already have spent billions of dollars. After Hurricane Sandy, we restored our beaches, the bulkheads and jetties along the waterfront. The U.S. Corps of Engineers spent a lot of time and effort to restore our shorelines. We reconstructed and strengthened boardwalks. Our boardwalks now are also seawalls, in addition to being places where people can walk and enjoy the ocean. In flood zones, single-family homes are now lifted on stilts. Our building codes require new construction to be at least 8 feet over the surface of the land. Uh, We've also taken some subway tunnels and made them waterproof. We've done a lot of things to make sure that the next time there's a flood, the impact won't be as great. Con Edison, our electric utility, spent billions of dollars protecting the electric generating system against flooding. One of the problems that we had in New York is that one of their plants in Manhattan got flooded early during Sandy, and that put most of lower Manhattan and some of the outer boroughs into blackout. The other thing we're seeing is we're moving utility rooms out of basements up into the third or fourth floor, and even sometimes the roofs of buildings. In other words, the basement, which is where you would put the furnace and the boiler and all the other pieces of equipment to help an apartment building or an office building, are no longer in the basement. The basements are now being used for other uses where this vital equipment has been moved upstairs with the idea that we're going to flood at some point, and let's make sure that the building can survive the flood. We've also built more permeable surfaces in parks, on roads, and public spaces. One of the problems in New York City is so much of it is paved, and so the water has no place to go, but eventually into the sewers. If the water could be absorbed by the ground, it creates less of an impact on the surrounding area. We've also planned additional green infrastructure, particularly for lower Manhattan, which is very close to sea level. And in fact, we're in the process of building new parks and areas that will be wetlands that can absorb storms. We've already implemented changes in zoning and building code to reduce damage from flooding. All of this came as a response to the devastation of Hurricane Sandy back in 2012. Now, that event was a turning point for climate adaptation in New York City. Now, we had been working for some time, even before that, on sustainability. Under Mayor Bloomberg, we did Plan NYC 2030. And what Mayor Bloomberg did is he tied environmental sustainability to economic development. And it was an amazing thing to see environmental justice advocates and real estate developers sitting in the same room and working together to try to help the city absorb the population that it was going to get and to improve its basic system. Plan NYC brought together over 20 agencies to develop 10 key goals and 127 initiatives to address issues of land use, parks, affordable housing, transportation, air and water quality, energy supply and demand, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. One of the most important initiatives from Plan NYC was, in fact, to build New York City's third water tunnel. Our water in New York City all comes from upstate New York. We had two ancient water tunnels that were leaking about a third of the water that came from upstate. And a project that started in the 1950s was finally completed during the Bloomberg mayoralty to build a new water tunnel so we could close the other ones one at a time to repair them. But during Plan NYC, that came before Hurricane Sandy, so we didn't really focus as much on climate adaptation. In October 2012, Hurricane Sandy hit the east coast of the US. 43 people died in New York City. Entire communities were destroyed. It left most of New York City without electricity for days or weeks. Some subway lines took months to reopen, and it demonstrated the weakness in many of our critical systems and infrastructure to major weather events. It caused an estimated $60 billion in damage on the East Coast, metropolitan area of New York, and $19 billion in New York City alone. And then in response, in June of 2013, the city released a stronger, more resilient New York, a plan that contains recommendations both for rebuilding the communities impacted by Sandy and increasing the resilience of infrastructure and buildings. The nearly $20 billion plan included over 250 initiatives. And I can say that over a decade later, many of these are complete and some are still underway. The initiatives were aimed at further protecting the coastline, the first defense against storms and rising sea level, as well as strengthening buildings and all the vital systems that support the life of the city, the energy grid, transportation system, parks, telecommunication networks, healthcare, water and food systems. New York City is a city that is highly interconnected. All of our food comes from other parts of the world. It all comes through the Hunts Point food market, and that market is located very close to the shoreline. And so our entire city systems needed to be rethought for dealing with extreme weather events. Then in 2015, under then Mayor Bill de Blasio, he linked sustainability to his top goal of reducing income inequality, changed the name of Plan NYC to One NYC, and added a focus on social equity and more explicitly addressed climate resiliency. This is a goal that's shared by President Biden in the United States. All of the climate legislation that has been passed, including what's called the Inflation Reduction Act, requires 40% of the funding, the multi-billion-dollar funding that's in that act, to be spent in environmental justice communities. And so that echoes the vision of One New York City that we saw from Mayor de Blasio in 2015. Now we have another mayor in New York City today, Mayor Eric Adams, and in 2023, he released the next iteration of the plan, which is Plan NYC Getting Sustainability Done, which highlights the efforts of the city to protect New Yorkers from climate threats, improve quality of life, and build the green economy. So now we have three very different mayors in a row, Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor de Blasio, and now Mayor Adams, all sharing the goal of climate adaptation and urban sustainability. So this is not a partisan or an ideological issue. This is a matter of pure survival. It focuses on, Adams' plan focuses on the execution and implementation of promises made to New Yorkers in previous plans to reimagine communities and create a more equitable, healthy, and resilient future. It highlights the opportunities to leverage available state and federal funding sources that combine with the city's resources. Climate adaptation requires private enterprise. It requires government at all levels working together in coordination. And that's something that the latest plan in New York City clearly recognizes. So let me turn to New York City's methods for mitigating climate change. So we're not only going to adapt to it, we're going to also contribute to reducing greenhouse gases. So as I said earlier, Plan NYC 2030 tied environmental sustainability to economic development. This idea that there's a trade-off between protecting the environment and growing the economy is pure nonsense. It's propaganda. It's never been true. In fact, what sustainability allows us to do is to modernize the economy so we can better compete in the global marketplace. Economic modernization is how we can and hopefully will build a political consensus behind environmental sustainability here in the United States. And hopefully this is the same kind of thing you'll be able to achieve in Brazil. So what are we doing here in New York? Well, first we set ambitious goals to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and decarbonize our economy. Perhaps the most important part of this is Local Law 97, which aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from large buildings. This effort has already begun. And so buildings of 25,000 square feet or greater are now required to gradually decarbonize over the next decade and also to pursue ambitious energy efficiency goals. There's other activities underway, increased bike lanes. We have the city bike sharing system, increased use of electric bikes and scooters. We're seeing more solar arrays on buildings. In fact, Kennedy Airport just announced yesterday that their new parking garage will have on its top, on its roof, the largest solar array in New York State. We're also focusing on energy efficiency, insulated windows, timed and sensor-driven lighting systems, construction of electric charging stations. One of the things you might notice if you go to a hotel in New York City that's different than hotels in other parts of the world is that when you leave your hotel room, the lights stay on. In most other parts of the world, you take your key and you leave the room and the lights go out. In New York City, we keep our hotel rooms lit day or night, whether we're there or not. Those are the kinds of things we're working on fixing. Our plans are to build an environmentally sustainable city. And we've now seen that through 3 straight mayoralties in New York. So let me turn to speaking more generally about the issue of environmentally sustainable cities. So what does that mean? It's defined as a city that uses resources as efficiently as possible, uses renewable resources as much as possible, recycles as much as possible, and has the least possible impact on the natural environment. Our focus on sustainable cities is because we have too many people in the world now for everybody to live in harmony with nature. We have too many people and not enough nature left. And so we have to make our cities efficient and reduce their impact. What's not sustainable in modern cities? The use of fossil fuels, energy inefficiency, the use of water and other materials inefficiently, waste dumped in landfill, insufficient recycling, congestion, toxic waste dumping, and pollution. Lack of resilience to climate impacts from sea level rise and extreme weather. So we have some things in cities that lead us to efficiency and sustainability, and some things that we really have to work on. Sustainable cities have productivity. Citizens can find decent work and businesses can thrive. Social inclusion, cities should create social mobility and integrated, equitable, and peaceful societies. And environmental sustainability, cities should have a minimized ecological footprint and be adequately prepared for changing environmental conditions. What's key about a sustainable city is that we share resources so we use less of them. It's a little bit like the difference between going to a gym that you join and is public and having your own workout room. You go to a gym, you're sharing equipment and weights with a community. And so the resource use per capita is much lower. If you have a home gym, you're the only one using the stuff. And so that uses more resources. The great thing about cities is we share resources. We share public space. We share social interaction. and we have an exciting and interesting place to live. What we need for a sustainable city is the organizational capacity to collect and recycle waste. We need to be able to generate renewable energy, maintain energy efficiency, and ensure the cleanliness of the material flow to develop what's been called the circular economy. We need green solutions to sewage treatment, water filtration, air pollution, toxic waste, and mass and personal transit. We have to transition old and decaying infrastructure as part of a renewable resource-based economy. What I mean by this, you take the electrical grid. The electrical grid in this country, the United States, is a century old. It's incredibly inefficient. A lot of the energy generated is never used. But if you use computer controlled microgrids and smart grids, you can actually reduce the amount of energy that is generated for the same use. But to do this, we're going to need both private sector initiative and public sector direction and incentivization and responsibility. This is not going to be done by government alone. It can't be done by the private sector alone. It requires both sectors to work in partnership. And this is a critical element of transitioning to a sustainable city. Organizations have to have the management and technical capacity to incorporate sustainability into routine decision making. And what I mean by that is that organizations must become more mindful. They have to think about, how do I reduce my use of energy? How do I make sure that the environmental impact of my operation is as little as possible? And in order for that to happen, the public sector needs to create incentives and build public-private partnerships. Local sustainability policy for this to happen will require support at the community level. This can't be a top-down policy. It has to be something that comes from the average person to the leadership. And how do you power the sustainable city? With a growing population and increased energy use, energy demand has increased substantially. Unless we end our dependence on fossil fuels, we cannot develop a long-term sustainable economy. So we need to develop a form of energy that's cheaper, less capital intensive, more reliable, decentralized, less polluting, and less dangerous than fossil fuels. This is happening right now. And the technological innovations that we're going to see over the next 20 years will be breathtaking. I often draw the analogy to what's happened with cell phones and what's happened with streaming videos and with the internet. All of these technologies have changed how we live and what we spend our time doing. My average student probably spends about 8 hours a day on a screen. I'm not sure I'd suggest that, but that is, in many respects, one of the least environmentally damaging things they can do. In any case, we do have to work to transition to renewable energy. This is not going to happen instantly. This is a generation-long transition. The good news is that the technology of solar and of batteries is advancing. And just as the first cell phones were the size of your suitcase and now they fit in your pocket, I think we're going to see the same thing with solar energy, solar cells, and batteries. We have to manage urban sustainability. The world's filled with people living in cities. About 20 years ago, a majority of the Earth became urban. Today, there are over 4.5 billion people living in cities. Over 57% of the planet's urban. In Latin America, 82% of the population lives in urban areas. In addition to the difficulties of implementing sustainable water, energy, food, and business practices, cities are faced with the challenge of waste management. If we're to support a human population of 10 buildings, our cities must learn to use renewable resources and recycle waste. Most of the distinct issues of sustainability management must be integrated within cities. And what I see happening in the long run is that we will have a waste management system that is powered, that is not, you don't home separate your recycling, it all comes in a single stream to what is essentially a factory where the waste is separated through the use of robotics and artificial intelligence, and then mined for the resources that we need. And so instead of mining the planet, we'll be mining our garbage. There are three main areas of infrastructure investment needed for renewable energy, though: solar, wind, geothermal, and hydro generation of power, smart grids, microgrids, and distributed generation of energy. In other words, the old model of a central power plant sending all of its energy out needs to be replaced by decentralized generation of energy through smaller sources of energy, including home energy generation. However, we will still need solar farms and wind farms, and to move that energy, we're going to need high voltage, long distance distribution lines. Investment should both modernize the grid, decentralize it, and enable homeowners to disconnect or reduce their dependence on the grid. Households will eventually be able to generate and store enough energy for their daily use. Improvements in battery technology and solar cells should make this possible. Building infrastructure requires constant public investment, and we still will need a grid for large facilities like data farms, universities, hospitals, and factories. But to build the infrastructure for the 21st century, for the second half of the 21st century, we've got to spend public money. Now, some of this investment can come via fees generated through public-private partnerships, but almost all of this infrastructure will require some kind of public subsidy based on the tax system. So let me conclude with some strategies and key takeaways. First, we have to connect economic growth to environmental sustainability. We need to present environmental sustainability as central to economic modernization. It's simply not viable to grow economically and poison the planet because we're just going to have to spend money to clean it up. Here in the United States, we have spent close to $500 billion cleaning up abandoned toxic waste sites since 1980. That's a huge drain on the economy. Damage to the environment is not free. It has to be cleaned up because human beings are biological creatures, and we don't do really well when we're drinking and eating poison. We also have to have a positive vision of environmental sustainability. We need standards, but we should improve through incentives rather than punishment. And we have to focus on sustainability metrics. I'm a management professor, and in order to manage something, you got to measure it, because without measurement, you can't tell if you're making things better or worse. And so we have to build a sustainability management culture. I want to replace these aspirational targets with rigorous measures of current performance and an operational emphasis on continuous improvement. The search for common ground and shared values is the key to building a consensus behind environmental sustainability. A stronger economy with lower priced energy, cleaner air and water, more resilient infrastructure, and exciting lifestyles is difficult to argue against. Everyone likes to breathe clean air. No one wants to eat poison or have their homes destroyed by extreme weather. I think these are common values we can build sustainability around. The public and private sectors play important and complementary roles in this transition to a sustainable economy. We absolutely need private sector entrepreneurship and organizational capacity, but we also need public sector rules and the capacity to build consensus. Private organizations will do most of the innovation and on-the-ground work to a sustainable, renewable, resource-based economy, but the infrastructure and regulation for sustainable cities needs government leadership, resources, and authority. Technological investment in renewable energy sources and battery technology is important. If we're going to have renewable energy, the current technology is not enough. The adoption of renewable energy will follow when renewables are cheaper and more convenient than fossil fuels. We have to focus on subsidies rather than penalties to encourage this transition. As I often say, in New York City in 1905, our biggest environmental problem was horse manure. We were knee deep in it. By 1915, the motor vehicle had replaced the horse. We didn't tax the horse. We created a technology that was superior to the horse. We called it the car. And that's what we have to do with energy. We have to work to modernize the energy grid with investments in smart grids and microgrids, invest in energy efficiency measure, insulated windows, timed and sensor-driven lighting systems, and other technologies like heat pumps. For resiliency, we have to replace aging and decaying infrastructure. Zoning and building codes need to be informed by climate risks to reduce damage from flooding. We need to strategically site solar arrays on buildings that are less likely to be impacted by extreme weather, strengthen our waterfront, raising structures in flood zones, protecting electrical generation systems from flooding by decentralizing the energy and moving building utility rooms out of basements in developments located near the shorelines. We also have to build more permeable surfaces in parks, roads, medians, and public spaces. In conclusion, while the transition to environmental sustainability is underway, building resiliency in our infrastructure, in our homes, is more important than ever. Resiliency can only be accomplished through public-private partnerships, strategic government planning, and forward-thinking leadership. We need community engagement, investment in public infrastructure, and innovative new technologies. I'm happy to take questions if I can.